The telepathic pulse hit every sensitive mind on the Celestial Archive Station at exactly 0347 hours. Those who could feel such things described it later as a wave of ancient sorrow, mixed with desperate urgency. The Star Dragon was dying, and it had one final request. Walter Reed was mopping the floors of Archive Section 7 when the station's emergency speakers crackled to life. He paused, leaning on his mop handle as the announcement echoed through the empty corridors. All personnel with telepathic sensitivity were to report to the medical wing immediately. The dragon wanted something. Walter shrugged and went back to his work. He was just a janitor, after all. Nobody would need him for whatever important business was happening 7 levels up. The medical wing had transformed into something between a hospital and a holy site. Representatives from 17 different species crowded the observation deck, watching through reinforced glass as the massive creature lay in the center of a specially constructed chamber. The dragon's scales, which historical records described as shimmering with the light of newborn stars, had faded to a dull gray. Its breathing came in slow, labored movements that seemed to bend the air itself. Ambassador Lyra stood at the front of the gathered crowd, her 4 wings held tight against her back in a gesture of respect. She had studied the star dragons in university, written her thesis on their role in early galactic diplomacy. To see one in person, even a dying one, felt like standing before a piece of living history. When the dragon's consciousness touched her mind, she nearly fell to her knees. The message was simple. The dragon wanted to see the human who knew its name. That was all. Just one request from a being that had witnessed the rise and fall of entire civilizations. Find the human who knows my name. The problem became apparent within minutes. Nobody knew the dragon's true name. The historical archives contained references to the star dragons, descriptions of their appearances, records of their interventions in galactic conflicts, but their names had been lost thousands of years ago. The species that first encountered the dragons had gone extinct. Their languages were dead. Their records were fragments scattered across a dozen different archive stations. Lyra called an emergency meeting of the human delegation. There were 43 humans on the station, mostly researchers and technical staff. She needed to interview every single one of them. Somewhere among those 43 people was someone who knew something that the rest of the galaxy had forgotten. The interviews began immediately. Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, the senior human archaeologist, was first. She specialized in pre-contact Earth civilizations and knew nothing about star dragons. Next came the linguistics team, 3 humans who worked on translating newly discovered alien texts. None of them had ever studied dragon languages. The list continued. Engineers, medical staff, cultural liaisons, all with their own specialties, none with any connection to ancient dragon lore. By hour 6, Lyra was exhausted. Her assistant brought her a stimulant drink and an updated list of remaining humans to interview. She scanned the names, looking for anyone whose background might be relevant. Most of the remaining people were support staff. Cooks, maintenance workers, administrators. She was about to set the list aside when one name caught her attention. Walter Reed, assigned to the Ancient Language Preservation Wing for the past 3 years. Night shift maintenance. It was a thin connection, but it was something. The Preservation Wing housed some of the oldest texts in the galaxy. If there was anywhere on the station where references to star dragons might exist, it would be there. Maybe this Walter person had seen something while cleaning, had overheard researchers discussing something important. Lyra sent her assistant to find him. Walter was on his break when the message came through on his work tablet. Ambassador Lyra wanted to speak with him in conference room 12 immediately. He stared at the message, confused. In 3 years of working on the station, he had never been called to a conference room. He had never spoken to an ambassador. He checked the sender details twice to make sure it was not some kind of mistake. The conference room was smaller than he expected, just a simple table and a few chairs. Ambassador Lyra was waiting for him, looking tired but alert. She gestured for him to sit. "Mr. Reed, thank you for coming. I will be direct because time is critical. Are you familiar with the star dragons?" Walter shook his head. "Not really. I mean, I have heard the name, but I do not know much about them. Have you ever studied ancient dragon languages or mythology in your work at the Preservation Wing?" "No, ma'am. I just clean and maintain the environmental controls. I am not a researcher." Lyra's wings drooped slightly. Another dead end. But she pressed on anyway. "In your 3 years working in the Preservation Wing, Have you encountered anything unusual? Any texts or artifacts that seemed strange or out of place? Walter thought about this. He thought about his nightly routine, walking through the quiet halls of the archives after the researchers had gone home. He thought about the thousands of texts and artifacts he had dusted and cataloged. Most of it blurred together after 3 years. Then he remembered the crystals. There is this one room, he said slowly, in the lower level of the wing. It has these crystal things. The researchers say they are broken, that they cannot get any data from them. But sometimes when I am cleaning near them, I hear something. Lyra leaned forward. Hear what? It is hard to explain. Like humming, but not quite. More like a feeling that sounds like music. I started spending my breaks in that room just listening. I know it sounds strange. Can you replicate the sound? Walter hesitated. He had never tried to hum it for anyone before. It felt private somehow, like sharing something that was not meant for others. But the ambassador was looking at him with such intensity, and there was something about the urgency of the situation that made him want to help. I can try, he said. He closed his eyes and thought about the crystal chamber. He remembered the feeling of sitting in the dark, the soft vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He let the first notes rise from his chest, a low humming that resonated in a way that normal sounds did not. Lyra's comm device, still connected to the medical wing, picked up the sound. 7 levels above them, the dying dragon's eyes opened. Its scales began to pulse with faint light. Every monitoring system in the medical chamber registered a sudden spike in consciousness activity. The dragon had heard its name. 3 years earlier, Walter Reed had arrived at the Celestial Archive Station with 1 suitcase and a heart full of grief. His wife had passed 6 months before, and Earth felt too full of memories. When the posting for maintenance staff came up, he applied without really thinking about it. He needed distance. He needed empty corridors and quiet rooms where nobody knew his story. The preservation wing had been perfect for that. The researchers worked day shifts, leaving the archives completely empty by the time Walter arrived at 2200 hours. His supervisor, an efficient woman named Rodriguez, showed him the basics. Keep the environmental controls stable. Clean the reading rooms. Check the preservation units for any fluctuations in temperature or humidity. Simple work that left plenty of time for thinking or not thinking, which was what Walter really wanted. The first few weeks had been difficult. The station was strange, full of aliens whose body language he could not read and technology he barely understood. He ate meals alone in his quarters and spoke to almost nobody outside of work. The loneliness was crushing, but it was also what he needed. Grief required space. It was during his 3rd week that he discovered the crystal chamber. He had been doing his usual rounds, checking each room systematically, when he opened a door marked Unclassified Artifact Storage 7B. The room was small, barely 10 feet across, with a single preservation case in the center. Inside the case were 7 crystals, each about the size of his fist, arranged in a circle. The information placard said they had been recovered from a dead world in the Outer Rim. Age unknown. Purpose unknown. Linguistic analysis inconclusive. Current status, inert. Walter had been about to leave when he felt it. Not a sound exactly, more like a vibration in his chest. He stepped closer to the case and the feeling grew stronger. It reminded him of something, though he could not place what. He stood there for 5 minutes, just feeling that strange resonance before continuing his rounds. He found himself returning to the crystal chamber every night. At first he told himself it was just part of his routine, but he knew that was not quite true. There was something about that room that felt like comfort. The crystals were old, ancient beyond measure according to the placard, and yet they felt somehow alive, not in a biological sense, but in the way that very old things carry the weight of all they have witnessed. Walter started spending his breaks in the crystal chamber. He would sit on the floor back against the wall and just listen. The humming feeling grew more distinct over time. He began to notice patterns in it, rhythms that repeated. It was not random vibration. It was structured. It was intentional. By the end of his first year, Walter could hum along with the crystals. He did not understand what he was humming, had no idea if it meant anything at all, but it felt right somehow, like learning a song in a language you do not speak. The melody carried its own meaning independent of words. The other maintenance workers thought he was a bit odd, but they left him alone. Rodriguez appreciated that he was reliable and thorough. The researchers barely noticed him at all, which was fine with Walter. He had built a small, quiet life in the archives, and that was enough. Now sitting in conference room 12 with Ambassador Lyra staring at him with wide eyes, Walter realized his quiet life was about to get very complicated. "That sound you made," Lyra said carefully. "Where did you learn it?" "From the crystals in storage 7B. I told you they hum sometimes. I just learned to hum along." "Mr. Reed, those crystals have been studied by the finest xenolinguists in the galaxy. They have been analyzed with every type of scanner and sensor we have. They are completely inert. They do not make any sound at all," Walter frowned. "But I hear them every night." Lyra's comm device erupted with urgent messages. She scanned them quickly, her expression shifting from confusion to amazement. "The dragon is awake. It is trying to move. The medical team says its consciousness levels have increased dramatically." She looked at Walter. "This happened the moment you started humming." "I do not understand." "Neither do I, but the dragon does." Lyra stood up. "Mr. Reed, I need you to come with me to the medical wing. Right now." They took the express lift, rising through the station's levels in silence. Walter's mind was racing. He was just a janitor. He cleaned floors and maintained environmental systems. He sat with old crystals because they made him feel less alone. None of this made sense. "Can I ask you something?" Walter said as they passed level 4. "Of course." "Why does the dragon want someone who knows its name? What difference does it make?" Lyra was quiet for a moment. "Names are important to very old beings. Not the labels we call them, but their true names. The resonance that defines who they are at the most fundamental level. For a creature as ancient as a star dragon, being known, truly known, might be the only thing that matters at the end." The lift doors opened onto chaos. The medical wing corridor was packed with people, all trying to see into the dragon's chamber. Security personnel were attempting to establish some kind of order, but nobody wanted to leave. This was history happening in real time. Professor Orinth, the Galactic Council's chief xenolinguist, intercepted them before they reached the chamber. He was a tall being with 6 arms and an expression that radiated academic authority. "Ambassador Lyra, I must protest this irregular procedure. This human has no credentials, no training in ancient languages. We should be analyzing whatever sound he produced, running it through proper linguistic databases before we allow any direct contact with the patient." The patient specifically asked for this human. "Professor, the patient asked for someone who knows its name. We have no proof this janitor actually knows anything. He produced a sound. That is all." It could be coincidence. Walter stood quietly while they argued. He understood the professor's point. What did he really know? He could hum a tune he learned from crystals that everyone else said were dead. That did not make him an expert on anything. But then he saw through the observation window into the chamber. The dragon was looking at him. Its massive eye, still bright despite the fading scales, focused directly on Walter. And in that moment, Walter felt the same vibration he felt every night in the crystal chamber. The dragon was not humming exactly, but its presence resonated at that same frequency. "It is calling me," Walter said quietly. The arguing stopped. Everyone turned to look at him. "I can feel it," Walter continued. "The same way I feel the crystals. It is the same sound." The dragon's medical team conferred briefly. Then the lead physician, a being whose species Walter did not recognize, made an announcement. "Patient autonomy is paramount in our medical ethics. If the dragon wishes to see this human, we cannot refuse." Professor Orinth looked like he wanted to argue further, but Lyra was already moving toward the chamber's airlock. "Mr. Reed, are you ready?" Walter was not ready. He was terrified, but he nodded anyway and followed her to the door. As he stepped through the airlock, the humming in his chest grew stronger. The dragon's scales began to glow with colors Walter had never seen before. He understood now what the crystals were. They were not artifacts. They were pieces of the dragon itself, shed long ago and waiting across thousands of years for someone willing to learn their song. Walter walked forward and began to hum. Inside the medical chamber, the air felt different, thicker somehow, as if the dragon's presence added weight to every breath. Walter's footsteps echoed on the smooth floor as he approached the massive creature. Up close, the dragon was even larger than it appeared through the observation window. Its body stretched nearly 50 feet from head to tail, scales the size of dinner plates covering every inch. The dragon's eye tracked his movement. Walter could feel hundreds of people watching from outside the chamber. but their attention faded into background noise. All that mattered was the resonance between him and the ancient being in front of him. Walter continued humming the crystal song. He had no idea if he was doing this right, if there was even a right way to do it. But the dragon's scales pulsed with light and rhythm with his humming, so he kept going. Then something remarkable happened. The dragon's presence expanded into Walter's mind, not forcing entry, not overwhelming him, but offering connection. Walter gasped and the humming stopped. The dragon's eye blinked once, slowly, and Walter understood this was a question, an invitation. He could refuse if he wanted to. Walter closed his eyes and accepted. The connection was not like talking. There were no words, no sentences structured in linear grammar. Instead, Walter felt impressions, emotions, images that carried meaning without language. The dragon was thanking him, not for coming, but for remembering, for sitting with the crystals night after night and learning their song when everyone else had declared them worthless. Walter tried to explain that he had not known what he was doing, that he just liked the way the humming made him feel less alone. The dragon's response was a wave of warm understanding. That was exactly the point. He had approached the crystals with no agenda, no desire to extract information or prove theories. He had simply been present with them. That was what allowed him to hear what others could not. I still do not understand, Walter thought, hoping the dragon could sense his confusion. Why me? Why a janitor from Earth who barely finished high school? The dragon's response came as a series of images and feelings. Walter saw civilizations rising and falling like waves on a shore. He felt the weight of thousands of years, the loneliness of watching everything you know fade into history. He understood that the dragon had been alone for longer than most species had existed. Names, the dragon explained in impressions rather than words, were not labels. They were resonances, the fundamental frequency at which a consciousness vibrated through the universe. Such names could not be written or spoken in any conventional sense. They could only be felt and echoed by those willing to listen without trying to understand. Every species in the galaxy had tried to translate the dragon's name into their own linguistic frameworks. They wanted to capture it, to pin it down with definitions and grammar rules. But names like the dragon's existed before language was invented. They lived in the space between thoughts, in the pause between heartbeats. Humans were young, so young that most galactic species still considered them barely civilized. But that youth meant they still remembered how to know things they had not learned. They could feel truths they could not prove. Most advanced species had traded that capacity for sophisticated analysis and precise measurement. They gained much in the exchange, but they also lost something vital. You are saying I can hear you because I do not know enough to know I should not be able to, Walter thought. The dragon's amusement rippled through their connection like warm water. That was close enough to the truth. Ignorance was not quite the right word, but innocence, perhaps. The willingness to sit with mystery without needing to solve it. Outside the chamber, Professor Orenth was frantically analyzing the audio recordings of Walter's humming. His instruments broke the sound down into component frequencies, mapped harmonic patterns, compared the results against every known language database. The analysis returned nothing conclusive. The sound Walter produced did not match any known linguistic pattern. It was just humming, but inside the chamber something profound was happening. The dragon was sharing its memories with Walter, not as information, not as facts to be cataloged, but as lived experience. Walter felt what it was like to witness a star being born. He sensed the texture of civilizations at their peak, the particular quality of hope that defined each age. He understood loss at a scale that made his own grief feel both small and infinite at once. The dragon had seen empires that spanned galaxies crumble to dust. It had watched species evolve from primitive tribes to spacefaring civilizations and then vanish completely from the universe. Every ending carried the same weight. Every lost voice mattered equally. Why show me this? Walter asked through their connection. The dragon's response was complex. It was dying, returning to whatever cosmic force had birthed it 40,000 years ago. When it dissolved, all of its accumulated experience would dissolve with it. Not the facts, those were recorded in 1,000 different archives, but the feeling of those facts, the emotional truth of what it meant to live through such vast stretches of time, that would be lost, unless someone could hold it. Not as data, but as understanding, as remembrance. The dragon was not giving Walter information. It was giving him depth, the ability to feel the weight of ages, To understand time as something more than sequential moments. It was a gift and a burden both. And the dragon wanted Walter to understand what he was accepting. Walter thought about his small life. His work mopping floors and checking temperature gauges, the quiet nights in the crystal chamber, the grief he still carried for his wife. What would it mean to add 40,000 years of memory on top of that? But then he thought about the crystals, about how they had kept him company when he was at his lowest, about how the humming made him feel connected to something larger than his own pain. The dragon had been calling across time, leaving pieces of itself scattered through the galaxy, hoping someone would eventually learn to listen. Walter could not refuse that. Would not refuse it. He opened himself fully to the connection and let the dragon pour its experience into him. The transfer was overwhelming. Walter's body collapsed to its knees, but his mind was expanding, touching edges of understanding he had never imagined possible. He felt the birth of the galaxy, the death of stars, the fragile beauty of every civilization that ever looked up at the night sky and wondered if they were alone. When the connection finally released, Walter was crying. Not from sadness exactly, but from the weight of everything he now carried. The dragon's eye was beginning to dim again, its energy spent, but there was peace in its gaze now. Gratitude, relief. Through their fading connection, Walter felt one last message. The dragon's name, the true name that was a frequency rather than a word, was now part of Walter's own resonance. When he hummed, he was not just repeating a song. He was speaking identity. He was saying, "I see you. I remember you. You existed and mattered." For a being that had outlived entire ages of the galaxy, that was enough. That was everything. Walter stayed on his knees beside the dragon as its breathing slowed. The scales lost their light one final time. The medical monitors showed consciousness fading. But Walter could still feel the dragon's presence, fainter now but not gone. Not truly gone, because he remembered. And in that remembrance the dragon would live on. Walter spent 3 days in the medical wing after his time with the dragon. Not because anything was physically wrong with him, but because nobody knew what else to do with him. He had been in that chamber for 6 hours. The medical staff had expected maybe 20 minutes of conversation. Then they would move him out so the dragon could rest. Instead, Walter had knelt beside the ancient creature while something impossible happened between them. The doctors ran every test they could think of. Brain scans, consciousness mapping, full neurological workups. Everything came back normal. Walter's biology showed no changes. But something had definitely changed. Everyone who interacted with him could feel it. He moved differently now, with a careful deliberation that had not been there before, as if he was aware of weight that others could not see. Ambassador Lyra visited him on the second day. She found him sitting by the window in his assigned medical room, staring out at the stars. "How are you feeling, Mr. Reed?" "I do not know how to answer that," Walter said honestly. "I feel like myself, but also like there is someone else's lifetime sitting in my head. Not memories exactly, more like echoes." Lyra sat in the chair across from him. "Can you describe what happened in the chamber?" "For the official record," Walter tried. He talked about the connection, about the way the dragon communicated through feelings instead of words. He explained how it felt to experience 40,000 years of existence compressed into a few hours. But even as he spoke, he knew his words were inadequate. Language was too small for what he had experienced. "The dragon gave me something," Walter said finally, "but I do not know what I'm supposed to do with it." "What did it give you?" "Understanding, maybe? Or perspective. I look at things now and I feel their age. Not just how old they are, but what that age means. Like this station. It is only 200 years old, which seemed ancient to me before. But now I can feel how young it is. How temporary. Everything feels temporary now." Lyra was quiet for a moment. "Does that frighten you?" "No," Walter said, surprising himself with the truth of it. "It is sad but not frightening. More like being let in on a secret. Everything ends, but everything also matters. The dragon wanted me to understand that." News of what happened had spread throughout the station. By the third day, Walter could not leave his room without running into researchers who wanted to interview him. Professor Orenth led a delegation of xenolinguists demanding that Walter submit to consciousness scanning. They wanted to map whatever the dragon had transferred to him, to preserve it in their databases. "The dragon's knowledge belongs to the entire galactic community," Professor Orenth insisted during one particularly tense meeting. "It cannot be hoarded by one individual, especially one without the training to properly interpret it. It is not knowledge, Walter tried to explain. It is feeling, experience. I do not know how to give you that. Then we must extract it scientifically. There are procedures for this. Memory mapping, consciousness transfer protocols. We can copy what is in your mind and preserve it properly. Walter felt something stir in his chest. The dragon's presence, faint but distinct, recoiled at the idea. This was not information to be extracted and archived. It was gift given in trust, meant to be held by a living consciousness willing to carry its weight. No, Walter said quietly. I am sorry, but no. This was given to me, and I will not let you treat it like data to be downloaded. The room erupted in protests. Lyra tried to restore order while various council members argued about protocols and precedents. Walter stood up and walked out. He was done explaining himself to people who would never understand. He went back to the crystal chamber. It was the first time he had been there since everything changed. The preservation case sat in the center of the room exactly as he remembered it. But when he approached the crystals now, they looked different. He could see them for what they really were. Not broken artifacts, but seeds. Pieces of the dragon scattered across the galaxy, waiting for someone to learn their song. Walter sat on the floor and hummed. The crystals responded, glowing with soft light. But the song was different now, richer somehow, with harmonics that Walter had never heard before. The dragon's essence in his mind was teaching him deeper layers of the name. He was learning to speak it more fully. The door opened behind him. Walter turned, expecting to see security coming to drag him back to the medical wing. Instead, it was Ambassador Lyra alone. I told them you were not to be disturbed, she said. They are angry with me, but I think you were right to refuse. You do? I've been thinking about what you said. About the difference between knowledge and understanding, between data and wisdom. Lyra folded her legs and sat on the floor beside him. The dragon did not give you information. It gave you the ability to feel what it felt. That cannot be transferred to a database because databases do not feel anything. I am glad someone understands. I am not sure I fully understand, Lyra admitted, but I am trying to. Can I ask you something? What do you think the dragon wanted you to do with this gift? Walter thought about that. He had been so focused on protecting what he had been given, he had not considered the purpose behind it. The dragon was lonely, Walter said slowly. It was the last of its kind. When it died, there would be no one left who remembered what it was like to be a star dragon. Not really remembered, not in a way that mattered. I think it wanted someone to witness, to hold space for its existence even after the body was gone. A living memorial. Yes, not a statue or a database entry. Something alive that carries the weight of what was lost. Lyra was quiet for a long time. There are millions of extinct species in the galaxy. Billions of individual beings whose lives have been forgotten. The archives preserve their languages, their art, their technology, but not what it felt like to be them. Not the emotional truth of their existence. No, Walter agreed. That dies with them. Always. Unless someone learns to do what you do, to sit with the remnants and listen, to remember not just facts but feelings. An idea was forming between them, not fully articulated yet but taking shape. Walter had been changed by the dragon's gift. He could not go back to being just a janitor who mopped floors. But he also did not want to become a research subject, prodded and analyzed until whatever the dragon gave him was reduced to data points. What if I just kept doing what I was doing? Walter said, sitting with the old things in the archives, learning to listen to them. But now I would understand what I was listening for. You would be a witness. A keeper of remembrance is something like that. I do not have the words for it, Lyra smiled. Neither do I, but I think we should try to find them. Because if you can do this, if you can learn to remember in this way, maybe others can learn too. Not everyone will have the gift. But some might, and those fragments of remembrance held by living minds willing to carry them might be the only way to truly honor the dead. Walter hummed the dragon's name again. The crystals pulsed with light. Somewhere in the resonance between his voice and their response, the dragon's essence stirred. Not alive, but not completely gone either. Held in the space between memory and presence, witnessed and remembered. I can try, Walter said. I do not know if I will be any good at it. But I can try. That is all anyone can do, Lyra replied. The dragon chose well. Not the most educated mind in the galaxy, but the most patient heart. That matters more than we realized. 2 weeks after the dragon's death, the Galactic Council held a formal memorial service. Representatives from every member species gathered in the station's ceremonial hall. They gave speeches about the dragon's contributions to galactic peace, its role in mediating ancient conflicts, its place in the historical record. Everything was proper and respectful and completely missing the point. Walter attended because Lyra asked him to, but he left halfway through. He could not stand listening to people talk about the dragon, as if it was a historical figure rather than a living being who had loved and grieved and hoped. They were already turning it into mythology, into something safely distant and academic. He went back to the archives and sat with the crystals. This had become his ritual. Every night after his maintenance shift, he would spend an hour in the crystal chamber humming the dragon's name and feeling its presence. The dragon was dead, its body cremated according to ancient star dragon customs, its ashes scattered in the gravity well of a nearby star, but something remained. Not a ghost exactly, more like a resonance that refused to completely fade. The door opened. Walter looked up, expecting Lyra. Instead, it was Professor Orinth. "May I join you?" the professor asked. Walter gestured to the floor. Orinth sat, arranging his 6 arms in a posture that Walter had learned meant respectful attention. "I owe you an apology," Orinth said. "I have spent the past 2 weeks analyzing the recordings of your time with the dragon, trying to decode what happened, to find some scientific explanation for the connection you shared. I have found nothing. Every analysis comes back inconclusive. The sound you produce is just sound. The dragon's responses show no patterns I can identify. By every measure, I know what happened between you should be impossible. But it happened anyway. Yes. And I have come to realize that my inability to measure it does not make it less real. It makes my measurements inadequate." Orinth paused. "I attended the memorial service today." "Did you?" "For a little while. It felt hollow to me. We were speaking about the dragon as if it was a concept rather than a person. I kept thinking about what you said, about remembrance versus knowledge. We have preserved everything the dragon did, but nothing of who it was." Walter hummed softly, a few notes of the dragon's name. The crystals responded with their gentle glow. "Can you teach me to hear that?" Orinth asked. "I do not mean scientifically. I mean truly hear it, the way you do." "I do not know if it can be taught," Walter said honestly. "I did not learn it on purpose. It just happened because I spent time sitting here without any agenda. Then teach me to sit without agenda. I am willing to try." Over the next week, Orinth became a regular visitor to the crystal chamber. He would finish his research duties and come sit with Walter in silence. At first, he fidgeted constantly, his academic mind trying to analyze and categorize everything. But gradually, he learned to simply be present, to listen without trying to understand. On the 8th night, Orinth gasped softly. "I felt something, just for a moment, like a vibration in my chest." "That is how it starts," Walter said. Word spread among the station's researchers. The idea that Professor Orinth, one of the most rigorous scientists in the galaxy, was taking lessons and sitting quietly from a human janitor was too intriguing to ignore. More people started showing up at the crystal chamber. Not everyone could feel the resonance, but some could. A young linguist from the Harmony Collective, an elderly archivist who had worked in the preservation wing for 30 years, a medical technician who had helped care for the dragon in its final days. Walter found himself leading informal sessions. He would sit with a text or artifact from the archives and invite others to sit with him. He did not lecture or explain. He just created space for people to be present with the old things, to listen for echoes of the consciousnesses that created them. Not everyone understood. Many researchers dismissed the sessions as unscientific mysticism. But those who attended found something valuable in the practice. They began to relate differently to their work. A historian studying an ancient treaty started to feel the fear and hope of those who negotiated it. An archaeologist examining pottery fragments sensed the pride of the craftsperson who shaped them. The archives were becoming less like museums and more like sacred spaces where the dead could still be felt. Lyra proposed an idea to the human delegation. What if they created a formal position within the archives? A keeper of remembrance, someone whose job was not to analyze or catalog but simply to witness, to sit with the forgotten things and hold space for their existence. The proposal met resistance from the Council's academic committee. They argued it was too subjective, too unmeasurable. How would they evaluate success? What metrics would they use? But the human delegation pushed back. Not everything of value could be measured. Some things required faith that presence and attention mattered even when they produced no tangible data. The debate continued for weeks. Meanwhile, Walter kept working his maintenance shift and leading his sitting sessions. He was not trying to prove anything or change anyone's mind. He was just doing what felt right. Then something unexpected happened. A delegation arrived from the Chorus worlds, a cluster of planets known for their philosophical traditions. They had heard about Walter's practice and wanted to learn from him. They brought with them fragments of their own lost history, artifacts from civilizations that had disappeared thousands of years before the Chorus people achieved spaceflight. "We have preserved these items," their leader explained, "but we do not understand them. We have studied them for generations with no success. We wonder if your method might help." Walter agreed to try. He sat with a crystal sphere that supposedly contained the memories of a dead species. The Chorus scholars had analyzed it with every instrument they possessed and found nothing. But when Walter held it and hummed softly, the sphere began to glow. Images appeared in its depths, not clear enough to provide historical data, but clear enough to convey emotion. Whoever made the sphere had been afraid. They knew their civilization was ending and wanted to leave something behind. A message that said, "We were here, we mattered." The Chorus scholars wept. They had been searching for information, for facts about the lost species. But this feeling, this emotional truth, was more precious than any historical record. They understood now what their ancestors had been trying to preserve. News of the incident spread. More delegations started arriving, bringing artifacts and texts that had resisted traditional analysis. Walter worked with each one, teaching people to sit and listen. Not everyone could feel what he felt, but many discovered they had more capacity for this kind of knowing than they realized. Professor Orenth became one of Walter's most dedicated students. He started publishing papers about the limits of pure analytical thinking, arguing that some forms of knowledge required different approaches. His work was controversial, but it opened important conversations about the nature of understanding. 6 months after the dragon's death, the Galactic Council officially approved the position of Keeper of Remembrance. Walter was offered the role, with full recognition as a specialized form of archival work. He accepted with one condition. He wanted to continue his maintenance duties as well. Mopping floors and checking environmental controls kept him grounded. It reminded him that the most important work was often the quietest, done by those who sought no recognition. The dragon's crystals remained in their chamber, but now they were visited regularly by people learning to listen. The room had become something between a classroom and a memorial, a place where the living could connect with the dead across the vast distances of time. Walter sat there one evening, alone again after everyone else had left. He hummed the dragon's name and felt its presence respond. Fainter now, but still there, still witnessed, still remembered. "Thank you," Walter whispered, "for trusting me with this, for teaching me how to listen." The crystals pulsed once, and Walter felt a wave of warm acknowledgement. The dragon was gone, but its gift remained. And through that gift, countless other forgotten lives might find someone willing to sit with them in respectful remembrance. 1 year after the dragon's death, Walter stood in front of a room full of students. The term felt strange to him. He was not a teacher in any traditional sense. He had no lesson plans, no curriculum, no tests or grades. But 23 people from 11 different species had signed up for his program, and they were all looking at him expectantly. "I am not going to teach you anything today," Walter said, "at least not in the way you are used to learning. Instead, we are going to practice sitting. That is all. Just sitting with something old and paying attention." A few students shifted uncomfortably. They had come expecting ancient wisdom, secret techniques for accessing hidden knowledge. Sitting sounded too simple. Walter led them to the crystal chamber. It had been expanded now with room for larger groups. The original 7 crystals remained in their preservation case, but the room also housed other artifacts. A broken musical instrument from a dead world, fragments of poetry in a language no one could read, a data storage device that had long since stopped functioning. "Pick something," Walter instructed. "Sit with it. Do not try to analyze it or figure it out. Just be present with it. Notice what you feel." For the first hour, most students struggled. Their minds were trained to categorize, to problem solve, to extract information. Simply being present with an object felt frustratingly passive. But Walter was patient. He sat with the dragon's crystals and hummed softly, creating a space of calm attention that gradually spread through the room. By the second hour, something shifted. A student from the Crystal Lattice Collective gasped softly. She was holding the broken instrument and tears were streaming down her face. "What do you feel?" Walter asked gently. "Joy," she whispered. "Whoever made this loved music so much. I can feel how happy they were when they played it. Even though I do not know what it sounded like, I can feel the emotion of the music." Others began to report similar experiences. Not information, but impression. Not facts, but feelings. They were learning to touch the emotional residue that clung to old things, the echoes of the consciousnesses that created them. The program grew. What started as 23 students became 50, then 100. People came from across the galaxy to learn Walter's method. Not all of them succeeded. Some minds were too rigid, too focused on measurable outcomes. But those who could learn found their relationship to history fundamentally changed. They stopped seeing the past as dead data and started experiencing it as a living presence that shaped the present. Walter trained new keepers, people who would go to other archives, other worlds, and practice remembrance. Each keeper developed their own style, their own way of sitting with the forgotten. But they all shared the core understanding that the dragon had given Walter. Presence and attention were forms of love, and love was what kept the dead from being truly lost. The archives themselves began to change. New sections were designated as remembrance halls, spaces where people could sit with artifacts and texts not to study them, but simply to be with them. These halls became unexpectedly popular. People who had lost loved ones would come and sit in the presence of ancient things, finding comfort in the continuity of memory across time. Grief and remembrance were universal, it turned out. Every species understood the need to witness and honor what was gone. Professor Orenth published a groundbreaking paper about the neural correlates of deep listening. He had finally found a way to measure what Walter did, tracking the brain patterns associated with receptive attention versus analytical thinking. The paper argued that both modes were necessary for complete understanding, and that galactic education had overemphasized analysis at the expense of reception. It was controversial, but it started important reforms in how the Council approached knowledge preservation. Lyra was promoted to head of the archive station. One of her first acts was to officially rename it. The Celestial Archive Station became the Hall of Remembrance and Preservation, acknowledging both functions as equally important. She made sure Walter had whatever resources he needed for his work, protecting him from those who still wanted to treat him as a research subject rather than a practitioner of a valid discipline. On the anniversary of the dragon's death, the station held a very different kind of memorial service. Instead of speeches and formal ceremonies, they held a galaxy-wide moment of silence. For 1 hour, people across thousands of worlds stopped what they were doing and sat in remembrance, not just for the dragon, but for all the lost lives that had shaped the present, all the extinct species, the dead civilizations, the individual beings whose stories had been forgotten. Walter spent that hour in the crystal chamber, surrounded by his students and fellow keepers. They hummed together, a harmony of voices speaking the dragon's name in the way it was meant to be spoken, as feeling rather than words, as presence rather than information. The dragon's essence, which had been fading over the months, strengthened for a moment. Walter felt a surge of gratitude that was almost overwhelming. The dragon had taken a risk, giving its accumulated experience to a simple janitor with no credentials or training. But the risk had paid off. Its gift had not died with Walter. It had spread, multiplying through every person who learned to sit and listen. The dragon's remembrance was no longer held by one human. It was held by a community, a movement, a new way of relating to history. After the hour of silence ended, people began sharing stories, not about the dragon specifically, but about their own experiences with remembrance. A researcher talked about sitting with a child's toy from an extinct species and feeling the parent's love embedded in its creation. A trader described holding a coin from a collapsed economy and sensing the hope of people who believed their civilization would last forever. A medical technician shared how presence with dying patients had become easier after learning Walter's techniques, how she could now hold space for grief without trying to fix or explain it. Walter listened to all of this with quiet amazement. He had not set out to start a movement. He had just been a lonely man sitting with crystals because they made him feel less alone. But sometimes the most important changes came from the smallest actions. Sometimes paying attention was revolutionary. As the gathering wound down, Walter found himself alone with the crystals one last time. He sat in his usual spot back against the wall and began to hum. The dragon's name had become part of his own internal rhythm now. He could not imagine not carrying it. "I hope I did right by you," Walter whispered to the crystals. "I hope this is what you wanted." The response came not as words, but as a feeling of deep peace. The dragon had spent 40,000 years witnessing the rise and fall of civilizations, accumulating a weight of memory that no one else could understand. In giving that weight to Walter, it had finally been able to let go. To trust that remembrance would continue without it. To rest. Walter felt tears on his face, but they were not sad tears. They were the tears that came from being part of something larger than yourself, from understanding, even briefly, the vast sweep of time and your small but meaningful place within it. He stood up slowly. His shift was starting soon. Floors needed mopping, environmental controls needed checking, the quiet, essential work that kept everything running. He was still a janitor, and that still mattered. The dragon had not chosen him despite his ordinary job. It had chosen him because of it. Because he understood that the most important work was often invisible, done by people who expected no recognition. Walter left the crystal chamber and walked through the archives toward his equipment locker. The halls were full of researchers and students all going about their work. Some of them nodded to him as he passed. Others were too focused on their own tasks to notice. That was fine. Walter did not need to be noticed. But he carried with him in every step the weight of 40,000 years. The dragon's gift. The responsibility of remembrance. The understanding that every moment mattered because someone was willing to witness it. He picked up his mop and bucket and got to work. In the quiet rhythm of cleaning, in the simple attention to ordinary tasks, the dragon's name hummed through him. A song without words, a memory without end, a life witnessed and honored through the simple act of being present. The dragon was gone, but it was also still here, held in the hearts of everyone who learned to listen, and that, Walter understood, was the only immortality that really mattered. Not in databases or history books, but in the living memory of those who carried forward the truth that every existence, no matter how brief or small, deserved to be remembered with love. He hummed as he worked, and the universe hummed back.